What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I'm super excited for today's episode because we're going to be starting seeds. Now, the seed that we're starting is not really going to be the subject of today's video. It's just what I'm out in the greenhouse doing right now. But what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be answering 5 of the most common questions that you all write on either email or on Facebook or even in the comment section on YouTube. And a lot of the questions, they don't warrant making a full video for. And so rather than take up 12 minutes of just answering a single question, we're going to just sandwich them all into this episode because I know a lot of you probably have the same questions. As they say, usually for every one person that's willing to ask a question, there's 10 people that are afraid to ask the question. And so I'm hoping that through this episode, we're going to help a lot of you out, answer some good seed starting questions, and help you guys grow big or go home. All right, let's go. All right, so the first question you guys all ask is seed starting mix. Which one's best? Which one should I go with? And when it comes to seed starting mixes, as I've said, they are all basically the same. Now, a lot of people will say otherwise. A lot of people will say, no, they're not all the same. Trust me, they're basically all the same. They all should have a base of either coco coir or peat moss, and that's the base that actually makes up most of the bulk of the mix. And then they should have something like, if they're made from peat moss, they should have dolomitic lime, which amends it to make it more pH balanced for your plants. When it comes to other things in a seed starting mix, it should be sifted. It should not have huge chunks. If there's large chunks of wood or other debris, I don't want it because ultimately that's going to make it really hard in these trays here, because when we're starting in a small tray, especially as small as this one, big chunks of wood really just mess you up. So I like to have it sifted. That's another criteria of mine. And then finally, it needs to have things like perlite and vermiculite. Perlite is the little white balls in here that look like styrofoam. It needs to have perlite and vermiculite. And that is really critical in a seed starting mix because it adds to fluffiness. It helps increase the porosity of the soil, helps roots to move throughout the soil better. And without it, you'll find that the soil kind of compacts and clumps, and you end up really having plants that struggle. It'll hold on to a little bit too much moisture, and seedlings, especially in plastic containers like this, do not like excess moisture whatsoever. So that's another thing. And then the final thing is I need to make sure that there's no soil. Now that might seem really counterproductive because we grow in soil, right? We're gardeners, we like to grow in soil. This mix here is soil-less. We've done lots of videos about how soil can actually mess you up when seed starting. Now, the reason why we want to go with soil-less is because we don't want to incorporate things like mold and mildews and other, creepy crawlies, insects that can come in on things like compost or composted manures. And a lot of times they will throw these things into potting mixes and sometimes into seed starting mixes, thinking, well, it's beneficial, it's nutritional, the plants are going to benefit. But in reality, when seed starting, plants, as we'll talk about, do not need that much nutrients to get started because most of the nutrients is locked in the seed itself. So you don't need any nutrients when it comes to your seed starting mix. It usually ends up bringing more bad things to the party than good. So seed starting mix just has to follow those criteria. Brand to brand though, I never really pay attention to brands. I just make sure whatever's checking those boxes and whichever one's the most affordable. All right, the second most common question we get asked is around fertilizer and should you fertilize your seedlings? Now, with seed starting mix in general, I always say you don't need to add fertilizer to it because you're going to be wasting time and money. A lot of people like to add fertilizer to their seed starting mix, and in reality, your plants aren't really uptaking it for the first couple weeks of their life. So in short, you don't need fertilizer, but I'll kind of explain further as to why. So the reason why you don't need to fertilize in a seed starting mix for the first few weeks is because when plants are growing, when they first sprout, they actually sprout what's called seed leaves or cotyledon leaves. And these cotyledon leaves don't actually use any nutrients at all. In fact, they actually provide nutrients. You see, when the plant is growing, there are 2 different types of leaves that each plant will form. The first set is the cotyledon leaves, and the second set of leaves is known as the adult leaves or the true leaves. And so the true leaves are actually when the plant starts to create energy through photosynthesis, but also will start to need some nutrients. Until that point, the plant does not take any nutrients whatsoever. And actually, like I said, the cotyledon leaves provide nutrients. They actually act as almost the placenta of the seed itself that actually will give nutrients And you'll notice that that's why the seed leaves over time will wilt and drop away, whereas true leaves typically won't. True leaves will continue to grow and get larger. That's because as the nutrition in that seed leaf is used up, it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's no more nutritional sustenance left in them. And then at that point, the plant will just drop them off. And so you don't really need to add any nutrients for the first 3 to 4 weeks, or sometimes even longer, until the plant is really indicating that it's starting to put on true leaves and is starting to grow past the seed leaf phase. So here we have a tray of seedlings at basically the cotyledon stage in their life. You'll notice that these leaves here, this is lettuce, they're just large and they're like basically just a single set of leaves, but in the center there's a teeny tiny little tuft, and those eventually will be the adult leaves that form, but they're not even close to forming yet. Over here we have this is collards. There's some broccoli here, or sorry, some kale and some cabbage, so you get your brassicas. And you'll notice that these leaves here just look very different from the actual adult leaves that are going to form. But in the center, you got that little tuft, and that's the adult leaves that will form in a couple weeks. But at this stage here, they're not using any nutrients at all. So we don't need to fertilize the seed starting mix because you're just wasting, again, time and money. Now, when we would fertilize is once these form adult leaves and it's time to move these from this tray into some larger containers, that's when we'd fertilize, because that's when they're going to be actually needing it. All right, third most common question we get asked is, when it comes to planting depth, how deep should I be planting my seeds? Now, when it comes to small little seeds like this broccoli here, generally the consensus is that you don't want to plant it any more than twice the thickness of the seed. And so I'm not sitting here with like a measuring tape at all, but I'd say this might be like 3 or 4 millimeters in thickness. So you'd want to plant it maybe like 8 millimeters deep. Now, obviously, if you don't know what 8 millimeters is, I'm not telling you to pull out a ruler and measure it, because seeds ultimately are not going to be that finicky. If they're buried 10 millimeters deep, you're probably still going to be fine. Or if they're buried like 4 millimeters deep, they're probably going to be fine. I generally use like my pinky nail as a reference, because my pinky nail is roughly about a 1/2 inch deep, and I generally only want to go about halfway up my pinky nail. So when I'm making my little divots here, I want to basically just go halfway up my pinky nail. Now, everyone's pinky nail is going to be a different size, but I kind of just use that as kind of like a 1/4 inch deep. And that's a great measurement for most average size seeds. If it's a larger seed, like say it's a bean or a pumpkin, that's really where, again, I would use twice the thickness of the seed, and I would go roughly about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch deep in the soil. And again, how I would reference that is I would just use maybe like my thumbnail, and I would just poke my thumbnail in, because that's about 3/4 of an inch-ish. Again, it's not rocket science. It's not something you have to overcomplicate. Generally, the mistake is made where you just way overcompensate, and like if these trays are an inch deep, it's like you're burying them almost an inch deep, and there's no chance that these small seeds are going to grow through an inch of soil. You're going to smother them, and that's ultimately what happens to seeds that get planted too deep, is they just get smothered. With seeds that are very, very, very small though, like exceptionally small, as in smaller than even broccoli, which is by most standards I think a fairly small seed. If you're growing something like chamomile or celery, or some of your flower seeds that are just microscopically small, generally those are going to be what's called surface sown. And that's where you basically just pack your trays down like this so there's good contact with the seed starting mix. You'll put your seeds in, and then you'll essentially not even put any more soil on top. You'll just leave them right on top, and you'll keep them well watered and misted, even sometimes covered with just like a little piece of cardboard to hold moisture near the soil, and then periodically checking it until sprouts are actually forming. At that point, then you can pull the cardboard off and just keep them watering, because the roots will then move into the soil. They don't even really need to be buried, because when you water, sometimes even, it disturbs the soil surface enough that the seed is so small, it kind of gets buried by that just slight disturbance on the soil. So you don't want to bury your seeds too deep. And when it comes to burying them not deep enough, that's just an unnecessary concern. A lot of people are worried that they'll mess something up if they just drop them right on the surface. You totally can. The reason why you wouldn't is just because seeds like this, the disturbance when you water will move them around and kind of displace them from time to time. And so it helps to kind of keep them in place, which is nice. But if you just take a packet of seeds and drop it on your, spill it in your garden, they're still going to germinate. So the idea that you have to bury seed is kind of just an old wives' tale. But you definitely don't want to bury them too deep, though. All right, fourth common question we get asked is in regards to the temperature that seeds are stored at. A lot of people will order seeds online, like MIgardener.com, and when they order, the seeds will come in the mail. And one of the most common concerns we get is from people that say, I left for a few days, didn't get to my mail, the mail was left at my porch or put in my mailbox. It was 0 degrees out. It was -5 out. Winter temperatures happen, and if you leave your seeds out, what is the repercussions of doing that? And the answer is nothing. The seeds, in fact, will be kept even more viable. Seeds have a viability that decreases in warmer temperatures, not colder temperatures. In fact, some of the most world-renowned seed vaults, these basically banks that store genetic viability for future generations, they will store their seeds at subarctic temperatures, -30, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are temperatures that are extremely, extremely cold, and it keeps the viability fresher longer. And so if you're someone that has your seeds sitting out in a mailbox, as long as it is kept cool, dark, and dry, that is all you need to worry about. If it is exposed to like moisture, like if you leave it out on your porch and it rains, it might not be the best. But if it's just covered by like a layer of frost, or that it got snow on the outside or whatever, as long as your seeds are kept dry, it's not a big deal. The cold will not harm it at all. But you'd be shocked. That is probably one of the most concerning things that people write in about during the wintertime, is just that. And there's really nothing you have to worry about at all. They're going to be fine. All right, the fifth and final most common question that you guys write in about, and I'd say this is probably number 1 or number 2 most common, is indoor gardening supplies, like stuff that you need to start seeds indoors. Now, when it comes to seed starting indoors, there are things like grow lights, there are things like heat mats, humidity domes, lots of stuff, grow tents, and who knows, there's fans and all this stuff. What I would say is that, do you need to start seeds indoors to have success? The answer is no. It's going to surprise you, but I've started seeds directly outside. Before I had the infrastructure to actually start my seeds indoors, I started them outside just as I'm doing right now, and I would start them just slightly later on in the season. Rather than start my seeds in February, March, or April, I might start my seeds in late April to early May, or even sometimes early June, depending on what I was starting and the conditions that it needed to germinate. I would start it right outside. And I think it's a big hurdle that a lot of gardeners have to just mentally overcome, is that seed starting indoors is a luxury. You don't need to start seeds indoors. Anyone that tells you you have to start seeds indoors is simply lying to you. Now, if you're living in a colder climate, like let's say you're living in zones 3 or zones 4, and you might only have 80, 90 days to grow, you might not be able to start a tomato unless you actually start it indoors, because it might not be a long enough growing season for you. Those are things that obviously are also choices you make. That's totally your choice. You don't even have to grow a tomato. You could still have a garden and have a very successful one by just picking more, shorter term crops or cold hardy crops. And so you don't have to start seeds indoors whatsoever. It is not a requirement. As it pertains to other materials though, like if you're insisting on starting seeds indoors, we have lots of guides on things you might need or things you may not need. But there's 2 things in particular that you really don't need at all, and that is a heat mat and humidity dome. Sure, you can use it and that's fine, but treat them like luxuries. They should be used in a very specific set of instances. We have videos on that. I'll try to link it in the description box down below to when you would want to use a heat mat and humidity dome. But I'd say 80 to 90% of the time, you don't actually need one, right? It's just a luxury. And so a lot of times people feel that there are things that they need, and they have a hard time differentiating the need from a luxury, right? A lot of things in gardening are luxuries. You don't have to spend a lot of money to grow a garden. You don't have to start seeds indoors. You don't even really have to grow in containers or have big fancy raised beds or anything like that. You could literally just till up a spot in your garden, throw some seeds down, and something's gonna grow. So it really just is based on what you wanna spend, some of your wish list items, and also the conditions that you have to grow in, right? So ultimately, starting seeds indoors is just a luxury that's gonna give you about 2 to 3 weeks of a head start. And that head start is nice if you need it, but you don't have to have it to have a successful garden. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to throw a like up there and subscribe if you haven't already. If you are someone that is brand new to gardening and you've had some of these questions, I would love to know which questions you've had that I answered in the comments box down below, but also take this time to ask any other questions. The really nice thing about this community is that not only do I read the comments, I read every single one, but I also reply to them when I can. But what's nice is that we have a lot of other loyal followers in this community that if they see someone that needs help and has a simple question that can be answered, they'll chime in and answer it. And I totally trust a lot of the answers that people give. So, it's one of those things where if you are feeling overwhelmed or intimidated by seed starting, comment down below some questions you might have, and you'd be surprised you might get an answer from someone that is not me, but is the answer you're looking for. So, as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. Take care, guys. Bye.